I would like to introduce Andy Armstrong. He has been caving since 1993. He has explored caves in 28 US states and 9 other countries, including expedition work in Lechuguilla, Jewel Cave, and Grand Canyon. He has been involved with the NCRC National Cave Rescue Commission since 2006, becoming an instructor in 2011 and serving as the Rocky Mountain Regional Coordinator for the last 5 years. Andy has participated in many cave rescue trainings and mock rescues in both the student and instructor roles. He has been involved in several real cave rescues, including small party assisted rescues from 1,000 feet underground and call-out rescues of inexperienced cavers. Andy helped to formulate and refine the NCRC Small Party Assisted Rescue course into its current form and stays busy teaching these and other NCRC courses across the country. So welcome, Andy.
Well, thanks for going with me tonight on a journey, and this is going to be a journey into the abstract world of human behavior. And I say it that way because many things in a cave rescue can be quantified. You hopefully know how many people are underground, you know the breaking strength of a carabiner, you know how to calculate the forces of angles, but human behavior is a little more abstract. And I find that the most important part of a cave rescue is communication. And we as humans are highly gifted in communication. It's the only reason that we can talk 92 of us across the country at one time. And it's the only way we've been able to learn all these things that other people have learned the lessons for us. But even though we are so good at communication, we're also pretty bad at communication. And what I mean is that it's not natural to many of us, and we have to work on it on a daily basis in order to have the best possible outcome. So I chose this photo for the beginning. This is a photo from one of our national seminar NCRC mock rescues. And this one in particular was really large with over 80 people underground working on different teams to bring several patients out of this cave system. And we train throughout the week in different teams and then or in different levels, and these levels get thrown into the cave to enact the cave rescue at the end of the week. And as an instructor, you can go in the cave with these teams. And so my role that day is I went in the cave with a search team that found a patient at the bottom of a 70-foot pit. And I was just in that observer role, and you really get a good perspective of the overall rescue, because as an instructor, you've seen the map of the cave, you've heard the overall scenario explained, and so you kind of have a bird's eye view where the people in the scenario are dealing with quite a bit of fog of war, and they don't know much about what's going on outside of their environment. So this particular search team was led by Michael Hopkins, and he realized that this patient needed some litter packaging material and needed to be carried out. And it wasn't too long, a cave field phone showed up right there at that spot, and Michael was able to order that equipment that he needed. But when it arrived, it didn't come with the blood pressure cuff that was mandatory at that time. We had to monitor the patients for real. So he knew he had to get it, and he knew it would be another major delay to get that equipment. So he called on the phone again, and they said, well, where are you? Where do we send this? He said, I'm in the fissure. And as soon as he said, I'm in the fissure, I knew he wasn't going to get that blood pressure cuff anytime soon, because there's a place on the map clearly marked the fissure about an hour and a half away. And so I had to keep that to myself, but it was a really interesting day all around, and lots of stories from that big mock rescue. But I did run into my friend Jeff Martin at the end of the day, who I believe was in level 2 at the time. And I said, Jeff, how was your day? And he said, oh, it was insane. It all started when they told me to take this blood pressure cuff to the fissure. And so I just wanted to tell you that story as one of many hilarious stories of fog of war and these mock rescue scenarios. But we do recognize that these mocks point out real communication difficulties that we need to work on. And next slide, please, Sarah. And so in a big rescue, you're going to use a system of communication. And one of the most common systems of communication would be the incident command system. And next slide, please. And incident command system often comes with flow charts of operations chiefs and team leaders, and it's like this network of chain of command. And lots of people kind of, in my opinion, get hung up on the who's in charge and who's in command. I think there's part of human nature that really latches on to those words, and it can be detrimental. And so instead, I'd like to ask you to think about that ICS flowchart as a system of communication. And you could think of it as a brain at the incident command post with all the nerves and neurons that go out to all the parts of the body that make things happen. You could think about it like an ant colony or a beehive. But the point is, we've all got to come together for a common goal. And the only way that we're going to do that is through a system of communication. It's the only way that any of this would be possible. So I chose this photo here because this is a cave in the Grand Canyon that I've been fortunate to be part of the exploration. And it's a 270-foot rappel in daylight. And then when you go into this cave entrance, there's still about another 300 feet below you. And we have a whole system of communication for getting in and out of the cave, 3 rebelays. And one thing we decided is just having 2 ropes and having 2 people go in and out as part of our system, just to help speed travel in and out. And so we have these systems of communication and systems of function on our cave trips already. Next, please, Sarah. One thing that happens when we come together with people that we don't know is we may not know them, we may not trust them. There's a self-help book called The Speed of Trust to talk about how when you trust someone, a lot of communication is fast-tracked, and some of it could even be omitted because you already know what the other person is thinking. And if you think about trust, it's the basis of any human relationship. And if you trust someone, probably all of your needs are being met in that relationship. And so if you know someone you trust, I would be willing to bet that you have good communication with that person. So when we have to work with outside teams and entities, the system of communication actually stands in for trust. And not only that, it allows us to build trust throughout the exercise. And so what I mean by that is, if I'm given the task to go search a certain area and report back at a certain time, the best thing I can do for that relationship is to make sure I report back at that time. And then when I do, I've already built a little bit of trust with the person I'm reporting to. And that might lead to greater opportunities for me and greater opportunities to affect a safe cave rescue. Next, please. Next slide, please. Oh, thank you. All right, and so one concept we talk a lot about in cave rescue and in communication is the concept of leadership and followership. Now, we all have some idea of whether or not we think of ourselves as a natural leader, but essentially we have to have people to lead and we have to have people to follow, or we could never have these multiple teams in this communication structure. And so I'd like it if you could in the chat, please, if you could think of what are good qualities of a good follower, someone who would make a great team member because they're a great follower. And either Sarah or Gretchen, if maybe you could read some of those out loud, but we'll just let that go for a minute.
Sure. So the answers are starting to come in. We have, so a good follower listens well, knows when to be quiet and knows when to speak up, clear communicator, good listener, humility, everything you want from a good leader, questions decisions that feel unsafe, wrong, listen twice, speak once, good at waiting, good listener, competent performer, supports the leader's decision.
All right. Okay, well, that's really great. How about if you want to add a few things that are good, or qualities of a good leader? Anything else that comes up?
So Bill France, who maybe has helped to teach this a little bit, says about the same. Leaders listens well, communicates clearly, utilizes the strength of group members, solicits feedback, knowledgeable.
Very good. All right. Well, Sarah, if you'll go to the next slide, I'll show you the list that I prepared. Okay, so this is a list that I put together. Is this a list of a good leader or a good follower? And I think you're catching on that the answer is it's the same list, right? So if you need the same skills to be a good leader and to be a good follower, how come some people are always followers and some people are always leaders? You know that we know people that have all these qualities and are great team members, but we don't see them in those leadership roles. And then conversely, we know people that are fantastic leaders and we don't see them in those followership roles. And then want to take a guess of what the difference is? Well, essentially, it's just your willingness to take on the role. So if you have all these qualities, but you don't lead, there might be a reason you're unwilling to take on that role. Maybe you don't have enough experience. Maybe you feel intimidated by the other team members. Maybe that's your level of commitment and you'll be a team member, but you don't want to lead the team. And then on the other side, we have people that essentially have all the right qualities to be a good follower, but they're not really willing to do it, right? And so I just wanted to ask you to think about your willingness to take on these different roles. You'll probably find you're more comfortable in one or the other, and that's fine, but just be aware that on a cave rescue, you will be a follower. You're going to report to someone, and there's a pretty good chance you will be either a designated leader or a de facto leader in some way or another. And so that's one good thing about cave rescue training is you get to pretend and be in these roles in a pretty realistic situation with lower consequences because we don't have an actual sick or hurt patient. Next slide, please. Okay, now we're going to talk about what I term operational shift. And I don't mean like a shift at the factory where you go in for an operational shift. This is a concept we talk about in SPAR courses where our cave trip is probably recreational, or maybe we're surveying, or maybe we're on a science trip, and then bang, something happens. And you know what those things are. Somebody breaks a leg, somebody's stuck on a rope, and then all of a sudden now we're in an emergency situation. And I would like to offer that operational shift requires you to make a communication shift. And the type of communication that we use in an incident, in an emergency, is different than casual conversation. There might not be as much polite language, but it is very professional and very direct and very concise. And we have to kind of cut through some of the noise and cut through some of the distractions. And so that can be uncomfortable, and it really doesn't fit with how we normally talk on a cave trip, right? And so we have to think of ways that we can build in what the communication structure will be once we have an incident, because as you know, we can't predict when that will happen. So this photo here is from Lechuguilla Cave, and on these expeditions where we camp and explore each day for a week, typically a group of 3 or 4 people leaving camp to go to a certain objective, all 4 of those people are qualified to be the trip leader. Like there's no, question that anyone could do it if they had to step up. The issue happens when you don't designate the trip leader and then there's an incident, and then you might have a discussion about who is the leader, and that's not really very productive at that point. So even though we don't normally have a very strict hierarchical communication structure, when we leave camp, we put our names on a list and where we're going, and we go ahead and we underline one of those names. And so we've designated this as our trip leader. And that trip leader is mostly invisible throughout the day, but we know if there's a question about when to turn around, or an argument about which lead to survey, or if there's an emergency, we've already designated who will be in charge. And so I would ask you to think about that and ways that you might add in a little bit of formality to the very beginning of your cave trip so that you can have a better transition into that emergency structure when it happens. Next, please. All right. So I call this slide Factors Affecting Successful Operational Capabilities, but that was mostly just an attempt at jargon, and I like how it sounds. But essentially, we have a lot of issues within our teams that might affect overall communication, right? And so our next speaker is going to be Alan Paget, who's worked on many gigantic cave rescues, and he's going to tell us more about the intricacies of that. And for the rest of my talk, I'd like to delve into communication strategies within our team that will keep our team functioning at the highest level possible so that we will be a link in the chain of effective communication throughout the rescue. And so we have a topic we talk about called HALTY. And if you'll go ahead and advance the next slide, Sarah, the first one is hungry. So that's the H in HALTY for hungry. And this could be hungry or thirsty, actually. And a lot of times if you're having someone kind of underperforming, not communicating well, it could be that they need some nutrition or some hydration. Next, please. And one reason we want to take care of that is because hungry can quickly become hangry, right? And that's the next one for A is angry. And why would someone be angry on a cave rescue? Well, believe it or not, people get angry in mock cave rescues as well. And there's a lot of reasons, and it can be egos, or it can be you're not happy with the task you were given, or you don't get along with someone on your team. But essentially, we can't have angry people in the chain of communication. Like, we have to mitigate that problem as soon as it starts to show itself. And so as a trip leader, you need to watch out for this and try to nip it in the bud as soon as possible. Sometimes you just need to let that person say what's on their mind and empathize with them. And in many cases, that's all they need to hear, and maybe just a reminder of what we're there for. The next slide, please. And so the next one is lonely for L. And it might seem like a weird one, but actually there are legitimate ways you could become lonely on a cave rescue. The classic one is you're sent to a phone station and with an indeterminate time period, and you've basically been sitting at that phone for 6 hours and only a couple of people have come by. That would be a legitimate loneliness situation. But what I'm really talking about here is the person that feels lonely within the team. They feel like they're not really part of the team. And that could happen because of inexperience or because of other people's egos or inattention. A lot of times these folks just need a little bit of encouragement, just a reminder, like we're all in this together. And especially as a leader, if you can, show them that you actually care about their welfare and their engagement with the team. Next, please. The next one is tired. So I'm sure we've all been tired caving, and you can get really tired on a cave rescue as well. Many times if it's a call out, you're going to be called in the middle of the night, interrupt your sleep. There's really long operational periods of 12 or 16 or 20 hours. And we need to be really careful with this and not burn people out and create further patience in the cave. One thing about resilience is not measured by how you endure, it's measured by how you recharge. And that's why you'll see on a cave rescue, there'll be a rehab station or rehabilitation station. So let's look at these fellas. If we sent them in on a search team and they found the patient and came out in 2 hours, well, we need to immediately send them to staging to the rehab where they can get some food and water and whatever medical attention they may need, because we probably will need to send these guys back in as part of a rigging team. And then when they accomplish that objective, they may need to rehab in the cave and get some snacks, because then they're going to get sucked up into the gigantic evac team, right? So there's a lot of ways that we can utilize people for long periods of time, but we have to be aware that humans can't just go full tilt for 12 hours. There has to be a cycle of rest and recuperation. Next slide, please. And we kind of cheated and made Y for hypothermia just because we wanted to get hypothermia in there. And hypothermia is always a constant concern with caving and cave rescue, especially that person that we ditched on the phone for 6 hours. So let's make sure our teammates are warm and fed and that their psychological or emotional needs are being met to the extent possible. And that will help us to keep communication flowing well within our team and through our team. Next slide, please. So this is a technique about communicating with direct statements. And this is when you need to cut through the fog of war or whatever distraction is happening. And one of the things I've seen happen several times in mock rescues is you have some team or some person that's coming out of the cave. They need to get out to report or whatever, and they come to a pit, and that pit that they rappelled down one rope to get in now has 3 or 4 ropes and webbing and all kinds of stuff hanging off of it because the rigging team has moved in. and they're turning it into a vertical haul. Well, this caver coming out really needs to know which rope is safe, which rope can I climb. And so, she'll yell up, hey, I need help, hey, tell me which one of these ropes I can climb, and the person at the top's like, what? And they're looking down, and there's just kind of this big disconnect. And in some cases, it seems like the person from the bottom does get their attention, and they're looking right at them, and it's like they just don't hear them and they won't answer the question. Well, probably that person at the top of the pit is really distracted by what's going on up there, and you don't even know what that is. And so this is a technique where you could maybe cut through that confusion and get someone's attention. And so I'd like to use an example from regular caving, not so much a rescue. And this technique has 4 parts. And if you'll go ahead and click to the next slide, please, Sarah. It begins with calling someone's full name. And so the example I like to give is, let's say I'm caving in one of my favorite places in Puerto Rico with my good friend Carlos Lau. And Carlos knows these caves like the back of his hand. I've been there a few times, and I know that these caves flood a lot. And you don't know when there's a thunderstorm up in the mountains that's going to cause the water to rise in the cave. And just in my few trips there, I've experienced that several times. And so on this cave trip, we're cruising through the Rio Camoy, and Carlos gets really excited about these fossils in the wall. Oh, look at these fossils. It looks like manatee bones. This is amazing. But while he's talking about that, I notice the water's coming up and it's getting colder. And I'm like, hey, man, I think the water's coming up. I think we ought to get out of here. And his response is something like, this is the best fossil I've ever seen. I'm like, yeah, but I think like the cave's flooding. And he's like, here, come check this out. And then, so at that point, I would say, Carlos Lau. I would say it just like that. And I know he would turn around immediately, because he knows like we don't usually talk to each other that way. So I've got his attention. And so the second part is I need to explain to him, what is my issue? Why am I bringing this up? And so I would say, Carlos, I'm noticing the water has come up on the wall, quite a bit. It's getting colder. We didn't have the greatest weather forecast today. And I think the cave's flooding. And next slide, please, Sarah. The next part, this is important. You need to go with a I think or an I feel statement. And this is important because many arguments happen because somebody feels like you're trying to tell them how they're supposed to feel. Well, if you just say, this is how I feel, that's kind of indisputable, right? And so I would say, I feel like the best thing we could do right now would be to get out of this cave. And then the final part, the final slide, is you seal the deal by saying, don't you agree? And that forces the conversation, right? And so when you say, don't you agree, you are having this person answer yes or no, and you have a conversation. So in my example, Carlos may not agree, but at least now I've got his attention, and he knows that I think there's a problem. And I would encourage you to try this out with your caving teams or your cave rescue teams. And I find it works well, even if someone has never heard any of this before, just because you can tell you're breaking into that world of formal conversation and it gets people's attention. But it's extra fun with a group that you have used this technique and a group that you trust them and you have a good relationship, so that that this is kind of funny at that point. So as soon as you say, hey, Scott McRae or Gretchen Baker, if you say it that way, those people would just immediately be like, oh, well, what's on this guy's mind, right? And then the don't you agree can be kind of fun as well. Next slide, please. And so I kind of want to end with this idea of the Swiss cheese theory. And I learned this from one of my cave rescue mentors, Rod Dennison, and it's kind of helped me to know what's safe and what's not, or at least to have some idea of that. And so basically how this works is Swiss cheese theory. We're talking about when should you use rule-based thinking versus critical thinking. And as a leader or a follower, you will often have to communicate these things and communicate why you had to make a choice, right? And so what I mean by rule-based thinking is if I ask you about your frog system and I say, well, why do you have that third cow's tail? And you say, oh, well, that's because some NCRC instructor told me I had to have it 5 years ago. Well, that's rule-based thinking, because you're just taking this person's word for it. And that's really valid and acceptable when you're learning a new task, right? And so you have to take people's word for it, because you can't possibly know all the theory and all the science and all the decisions that went into a particular technique or a particular piece of gear. So you learn that way, but you need to immediately start figuring out what are the reasons behind that. And that's the critical thinking part. And so as you use critical thinking, you learn these things and you can start to question some of the rules. And in some cases, once you really know what you're talking about, you might be able to bend some of those rules. And that can be really hard when you're a trip leader underground, especially in a rescue, sketchy situation. You feel like you might be, inclined to try something with a different piece of gear than you normally use, or you're not really sure of your teammates' abilities. And so this can be a very difficult choice. And so I just wanted to offer that you should think about what is your level of fluency in this particular subject or this particular language. And so my examples are, I feel like I have at least three journeys that I'm on and I'm going to be on for the rest of my life. One of them is I'd like to learn how to speak Spanish. One of them is I'd like to learn how to play the guitar. And one of them is I'd like to learn how to rig all this cool cave stuff and know how it works and be able to explain it. And all three of those things are journeys that I've already been on for a long time, like actually decades in all those cases. And so it's not like I'm a ranked beginner at them, but I need to realize that I'm on the journey. I'm still, I'll never get to the end, and I got to keep going on the journey for the rest of my life. And I can try to be honest with myself about what is my fluency in those particular areas. So if it's something you've done 50 times or 100 times, and you know all the ins and outs, and you know the people that make the gear and why they made the choices they did, well, you might be able to improvise a little bit, right? And you might be able to use a different carabiner, or possibly even leave a piece out of the system or something like that. But if it's something you just saw in a book, or you've practiced once in a SPAR class or anything like that, you need to realize you're not very fluent in that particular subject. And I would encourage you to go more rule-based in those scenarios. So you can think of this as a spectrum of I'm kind of a beginner or I'm an expert, and it's not in general, it's for every situation. You have to evaluate every factor that way. But when you are in your element and you know exactly what you're doing, you might be able to MacGyver a few things and do some kind of interesting stuff. But if you're out of your element, please revert to what you know and are sure is safe. And sometimes that is just, I can't handle this and I need more help. That's often the right choice. So to bring it back to the Swiss cheese, the way this was explained to me, you have a block of Swiss cheese. And what is Swiss cheese like? It has a bunch of gas bubbles in it, right? And before you cut the cheese, there's no hole that goes all the way through that block, right? But we're going to slice it up into 10 different slices, and there's still no hole that goes all the way through. And so that kind of represents the technique as you were taught it, or the way it is in alpine caving techniques. You don't know why it's that way, but that's the way you know it will work. But then when you start to improvise, we're going to start taking those slices of cheese and shuffling them around and putting them in different places in the block. And the point is, at some point, you exceed your ability to improvise, and you're going to break a rule, and you shuffle those slices enough, and you're going to end up with a hole that goes all the way through the cheese. And that's our fatal error, our fatal flaw that we're trying to prevent. So just remember to, be careful with those choices. And that's, I bring it up in a communication talk because you might have to explain to your team, well, I know that we practice this, but we're not going to do it today, and this is why. Or actually, I think we can do this a little bit different than what we saw before, and here's why I think that's okay. And you need to be able to justify that, because the people you're working with might be a little more rule-based than you if you are actually more experienced than them. So that's what I had for you tonight. I wanted to just kind of reiterate, we talked about some strategies for overall cave rescue communication. And hopefully in the second part, you got some tools and techniques that will help you to improve communication on your cave trips and on any cave rescues that you might find yourself in. And I think the last slide is just the end slide if you want to go to that one. And I want to thank you for going on this journey through the abstract world of human behavior with me. And these are just some things that I've learned along the way. And thank you for your time, and I'd be happy to take any questions that you have.
So if you have any questions, if you can type those in the chat, or you can raise your hand down in the bottom bar. Okay. Yeah, this is a really useful thing. So the other thing that's kind of fun to do is practice that direct communication using, if you might want to just write something out, you could even put it in the chat if you're comfortable with it, of putting who you're talking to, the situation, your I think or I feel statement, and don't you agree? And like Andy said, it's really fun if your team has practiced this together, because that when you hear that don't you agree, it sort of like is a wake up, like, oh yeah. If you didn't wake up when they said your full name, you're like, oh wait a minute,
Yeah.
I'm like really missing a main point here.
I've taught people that technique, and then within a couple of days, I can tell I'm the one that's like being distracted, and they'll say, don't you agree? And I'm like, ah, you got me. So.
All right, so we have a question. Would you talk a little bit about changing leaders during a situation?
Sure. Yeah, it can be tricky. And so one example I like to use is at work, we get into some vertical situations, and some of those things are more of what the maintenance crew does. I work on the resource stewardship and science team, but I do help them a lot with vertical operations. And so we'll go up to, where we're going to start, and we'll have a team meeting and say, okay, well, the facility manager, he's the leader today. He's going to call the shots. He's going to lead the operation. But if there's an emergency that happens, if I'm there, they'll say Andy's here. He's a wilderness first responder and knows how to do some rescue stuff. So we're at that point, we would change and follow him. And so that's kind of easy to do in a work situation and not as comfortable to do in a casual friend situation. But I think you can still have an honest conversation about who knows the cave the best, who. Sometimes it's obvious who the trip leader is because of that, or because they have the permit, or because of whatever. But sometimes that trip leader is not necessarily the most skilled in emergency management, but somebody on the trip might be, and it might be worth just kind of having that conversation beforehand. And then I think if you're in a situation, and the way it happens to me is that I'll feel like, oh, I think I know what I would do, but you want to be respectful of the leader. Just try to be a really helpful follower. And, that's a fine line, right? You have to make sure you are being helpful, but sometimes you do have the answer that the leader needs. And so you can kind of just do that lead from behind thing. And then I've seen that done so effectively where eventually the leader's like, you know what, I think we should just follow. I think we should do it your way, and we should follow you now. So, I mean, it can happen. But usually you're probably just going to try to influence the decisions of the leader.
Thanks, Andy. We have another question for you. What do you recommend for communication over long distances?
Yeah, so in the cave rescue, the best tool that we have are the military field phones. We don't typically have cave radio, ground to surface to cave situations that will work in this country. Are not like ready to go anyway. But most cave rescue teams and NCRC regions have military field phones that the ones we use now are really effective. There's supposedly will work over 14 miles of wire, and you can have any number of phones hooked up. And they have batteries where they have a ringer, and it's a powered signal. And it really sounds a lot clearer than what you're hearing me over tonight, honestly. And they're so good that you can actually, even if no one pushes down the push to talk button, you can hear all the conversations around 5 or 10 feet around the phone. So that's kind of our gold standard. And that's why we teach that the phones are going in as soon as possible. And that's why in that mock rescue example I gave, it really was like we found the patient, we were there 20 minutes, and then there's a phone and you can talk to the surface. And so that's what we're going for in most cases. But obviously that's not going to work all the time. And so you do have to get creative with runners and notes, and those are techniques we teach as well. They're not as great, but it might be all that you have.
Thank you. Do you have any recommended reading for communication strategies?
Well, some of these strategies come from that old Vines and Steve Hudson rescue book. I got some of that from there. The National Park Service basic rescue techniques manual has some of these in there. And I would just encourage you to seek those things out, like on YouTube and TED Talks and things of that nature. Because I really feel like, yeah, we need to know how to rig things and how to haul litter, but the hard part is talking to people. And so for me, I've just been on a journey of trying to learn more techniques, because some of this doesn't come natural to me. But once I learn more about where other people are coming from and what might motivate them, so I would just kind of encourage you to go a little bit more into the Zen, self-help kind of human relations world. And I think you'll get more techniques there to bring back into rescue than you would from most of the rescue manuals.
Thanks, Andy. This is from Ellen in Carlsbad, New Mexico. Andy Armstrong, this has been a great presentation. I think you did a great job. Don't you agree?
Thank you.
Nice. Very nice use of that technique. Yeah, there's some interesting conversation in the chat between ending it with "don't you agree" or should it be "do you agree" or "does that make sense?" Do you want to speak to that, Eddie?
Yeah, I think "that makes sense" is a good one as well. Or does that make sense? It needs to be a question that can be answered with yes or no. Yeah, I see somebody says, "what do you think?" That could kind of maybe work, but in some cases, if it's really like a difficult situation, like I use the example of a friend, but you might have to use this against somebody like, or with somebody you don't really get along with, or you think is kind of belligerent. And so I would encourage you to kind of stick to the script and make them answer your yes or no question before they tell you what they think.
Excellent. Okay. And I'm just checking in here. Here's a general question I think you can answer, Andy. What ICS levels are recommended for being involved in cave rescue?
I'm going to get this wrong, but I'm pretty sure it's 100 and 700. And there's another one too, 200 or 300. I can't remember. I'm sorry. But there are free online FEMA ICS classes that you can learn about that. And keep in mind, it'll be, more for all incidents, wildfires, hurricanes, Olympics, all of that. That's the great thing about ICS is it expands and contracts and can be used to manage any of that, including your daily life at work. If you want to go that way, it's a way to keep things organized. And then when you take an NCRC class, we don't teach like strict ICS, but we talk about it as a tool and how there has to be some kind of communication structure. But essentially, it's all about positions and not people. And that's why, like in a work situation, I might end up reporting to somebody that's, normally not in my chain of command, and possibly, somebody that maybe even reports to me on a day-to-day basis. I might be their report in an ICS situation.
Okay, Andy, have you ever encountered someone Swiss cheesing the chain of communications on a rescue? And if so, how did you deal with that?
That's a really good one. I saw that one pop up and I kind of laughed when I saw it, because, yeah, I was on one that was really bad that way, where I wasn't given a clear job and I was told to stay in the cave till we got him out. And then there were because the cave was shallow, we had radios that worked underground, and there were all these different agencies with different radios going off, and it was like a cacophony of noise. It even got to the point where they brought in a squawk box, so like the patient could talk out to his family who was out on the surface, which was weird and interesting. But then at one point, people were calling from the command post through the squawk box, asking me questions, like wanting me to talk to somebody on the surface through that. And I was like, it was just really a really bad communication situation where I felt like there were clear goals. There was confusion. There was a lot of distraction. And in that situation, the only thing I was able to do is just keep trying to make what's the best decision I can make right now? What's the best thing I can do to help right now? And reevaluate and just try to do the best I could. But at that time, I was, kind of just a worker bee, and none of these people knew me, and I didn't have a lot of ability to make big changes to it. And so I think it kind of gets back to that whole sphere of influence and sphere of control thing. You can only have influence on the things, within that sphere. And I think if you just keep trying to put good, positive things into whatever that sphere is, that's the best you can do.
Great. Bill France made a comment that you may want to respond to. If it's a casual trip with friends, there may not be a designated leader.
Yeah, and that's what I was trying to address earlier. And it usually happens not so much when there's beginners, because I think we tend to want to have a leader for them to learn from and take direction from, but it's more that group of friends where we're all kind of at the same skill level, more or less. And so that's the one I'm challenging you to think about. And my friend Tom Evans does a good job at this, and I've been on cave trips with him where take 5 steps from the car, and he's like, all right, everybody get in a circle. And he wants to know, like, what's your medical experience? What do you have in your pack? How are you feeling today? What's your mother's maiden name? No, not that bad, but he goes pretty intense on it, and it's a little shocking right at first. And then you're like, well, okay, this is probably good, because I didn't know this guy didn't know anything. He didn't know how to do CPR, and I didn't know this guy was an EMT, and this person's some kind of rescue whiz, and they got all these pulleys in their pack. And so it does kind of set up that conversation that I'm talking about, where you acknowledge that you're going to do something that has risk and that there could be consequences, and you kind of need to have a plan for when there are consequences.
And what happens if the designated trip leader is the one that gets injured?
Well, I think I won't be able to answer every possible what if, but I think that's a good question. And I think in some cases, the trip leader is not going to be the person that you've designated to lead the rescue. I think that's pretty common, actually. But it's worth talking about if the same person is the trip leader and the person you want to lead the rescue effort, it would be worth mentioning, like, well, what if it's you? And I've heard that come up before in terms of like getting out of the cave, when there's only one person that really knows their way around. And that's one thing I really like about cavers is we don't really have much of a guide and client mindset like some other outdoor sports do. I see that a lot here in Utah, where there's one person that knows what the heck's going on, and everybody else just like signed up on a meetup group or something. And every cave trip I've ever been on, it seems like the whoever is the leader makes an effort to say, hey, check the rigging. What do you guys think? Make sure you turn around and see your way out. And I think a good leader will do that, because they know if they get hurt, these people that they've brought into the cave are their only chance, right? So I think most cavers that I've caved with do make an effort to make sure the whole group understands and the whole group can do the techniques, and hopefully the whole group knows how to get out and knows what to do if there's a problem. It's more of a team mindset than a leader and a follower.
Well, thank you, Andy. This has been a great talk about communications, and thanks for taking all these questions. Would everyone please join me in congratulating Andy on a good talk?